Hello, I am Dr. Felice, your integrative OBGYN physician, and I am here to educate you and inform you and hopefully excite you about all aspects of female health. Now, what are we going to talk about today? Well, many of my patients come in and they say, Dr. Gersh, I think I have a leaky gut. And clearly this is out there all over the place, social media, and you can Google it and lots of blogs will come up and so forth. But I want to make sure that when we talk about leaky gut, we're all talking about the same thing. Now, there is definitely a silent epidemic of so-called leaky gut. Now, back, maybe a decade or more ago, when Alessio Fasano, who is a physician very renowned, he is currently at Harvard Medical School, he was talking about the issue of leaky gut, and doctors ridiculed him. Well, it turns out that there is such a thing as leaky gut. So what is it? Well, the intestinal tract has a lining, and that lining is called the epithelial lining, made up of specialized cells and different types of cells, but it's in a single layer. And they are close together with what are called tight junctions, but they're not fused together. There's a tiny, tiny little space between each of these enterocytes, these lining cells of the gut. Now, why would there be a space? Well, because sometimes nutrients pass from inside the opening, the lumen of the gut, through these little spaces to get into the body proper. In addition, the immune cells which line the gut, so 70-80% of all the immune system of the body is on the interior side of the intestinal tract, which is called the GALT, the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. Now, these areas of immune cells, they contain the whole array of different types of immune cells. Well, one of the types is a group called dendritic cells. These dendritic cells have little fingers, kind of like an amoeba. And so between the different lining cells, they will put their little tentacle type things called dendrites, and they check what's going on inside that gut lumen. And so it's like our own little, I think of them as our own little inborn antenna, because then once that little dendritic cell checks what's going on, it then communicates to other immune cells about what's going on. Because these little dendritic projections, they have receptors on them called toll-like receptors that allow them to perceive what is going on. And then they in turn pass that information on so that the immune system can appropriately respond to what's going on in there. So it turns out that when you have the wrong diet and you end up getting the wrong microbial population called the gut microbiome. So the gut microbiome, which is like a secret population of trillions of microbes. It includes bacteria, but not actually only bacteria. There's also viruses, there's fungi, there's another group called archaea, and all of these different types of microscopic cells. They work in this beautiful synergy, this incredibly complex ecosystem to maintain our health. They're not like freeloaders. They are incredibly important. The microbes, they make things like hormones. They make neurotransmitters. They actually make vitamins. So they're not exactly dispensable. They're essential. Well, one of the things that they do is they work in conjunction with our own cells to make a mucus protectant. So like a coating for the inside of our gut along this lining of the enterocytes to protect these cells from the caustic and toxic chemicals that can be produced and the bacteria that are within the intestinal lumen, the space. Now, when you have the wrong microbes, you no longer produce this incredibly important mucus protectant covering. Mucus is really important. I know you've heard of mucus. There's mucus linings that cover many of our epithelial linings. And this is as a protection. And when you lose it, then you lose the proper function, and you can have damage to the lining tissue, and you can also have passage between the cells of toxins, bacteria, other particles, and so on. In the GI tract, when you have the loss of this mucus protectant, then the toxins that are produced within the lumen, called lipopolysaccharides, also known as endotoxins, like toxins from within. And you get many more of these produced when you have the wrong microbial population, or what we call a dysbiotic microbiome. You have an abnormal grouping of microbes, and then they in turn make more toxic products, and the microbes themselves are actually toxic. And what happens is these lipopolysaccharides or endotoxins, then they can actually cause more damage, and you lose that mucus protectant covering. And the lining cells that are called these enterocytes, this epithelial lining, the lining cells that are close together with these tight junctions, they're held together by little fibers, little types of connective tissue, and they break down. And then the cells start to drift apart, and there's more space between them. And that's called impaired lining, okay? So the intestinal barrier becomes impaired. The other name for an impaired intestinal lining is leaky gut, because as these lining cells, these what are called the enterocytes, as they drift apart and create more space, these toxins from within, these endotoxins, can pass between these cells that have created this big space, kind of like the floodgates are open and they're flooding into the body. Now, on the other side of the lining of the gut, there resides a huge amount of immune cells, all the different types of the immune cells of the body. So when they are confronted with this chronic leakage of this toxic stuff coming in, well, they do what they're designed to do. They react. So the first responders, those are the innate immune cells. They create inflammatory cytokines. I know all of you, because of COVID, have heard of inflammatory cytokines. So they're little particles that are designed to help create an inflammatory response, which in cases where you have an infection, when an infection initially begins, that is what is life-saving, to have that inflammatory response. But it's not supposed to be continuous, and this is not a normal situation here. But now, if you have chronic leakage through this impaired gut barrier, the leaky gut, you have these endotoxins leaking perpetually into the body. And it's like a chronic infection. And when you have this chronically, in addition to this chronic state of inflammatory cytokines being released, which creates systemic or total body inflammation, you also have different parts of bacteria coming through. Now, what happens when you're exposed to inappropriate bacteria or viruses? What happens is our immune system is activated to produce antibodies. That's part of our defense mechanism. But now they're producing antibodies on a continual basis against these bacteria and bacterial particles that are leaking in through the leaky gut, through the impaired gut barrier, into the gut-associated lymphoid tissue surrounding the intestinal tract. Now, when you have a chronic infection, you're going to have chronic production of antibodies. These antibodies are then attacking the passage of these bacteria and viruses. That's not a problem. The problem is that bacteria and viruses, their foundational building blocks, their nucleotides, are the same as ours. So all life forms on Earth evolved from the same primordial pool, we'll say. So if you consider a bacteria or a virus to be like a little Lego, then we, humans, are like Legoland. We're built from the same foundational building blocks. So when we make antibodies against a bacteria or a virus, those antibodies will actually attack our cells, our own tissue, because they look alike. We call that molecular mimicry. It's like friendly fire or false identification, and that is okay. That's what happens whenever you have an infection. You will always make some antibodies against your own tissues. But it's okay if you resolve the infection, and then you don't need to make high amounts of antibodies. It dies down, the infection dies down, our body eliminates the invading pathogen. But what happens when that doesn't end and you have a constant influx of toxic bacteria and particles of bacteria, and you keep making antibodies? Well, that's the ticket to developing autoimmune diseases. So leaky gut has many consequences. One is that it can increase the risk of developing an autoimmune disease. The most common is Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or autoimmune thyroid disease. And that's especially common in women. Now, there are many other autoimmune diseases, and they have actually been linked to leakage, many of them, of specific viruses and bacteria. Now, after a while, it can become sort of self-perpetuating. But this is a really important reason, one of many, why we don't want to have leaky gut. Another is when you have chronic leaky gut and you're having the bacteria and toxins, these endotoxins coming in, creating this production all the time of inflammatory cytokines. This creates systemic inflammation. We don't want to be like on fire, even a low simmer. We don't want that. So we only want inflammation that's appropriate and short term to deal with an immediate issue like trauma, damaged, injured tissue, or an infection with a pathogen. But when you have a chronic state of trauma or a chronic state of infection, these bacteria and viruses coming in, and you have a chronic state of inflammatory cytokines being produced, you will have systemic inflammation. And that is what underlies so many things that are considered abnormal in the body. You can have neuroinflammation, inflammation in the brain, and we know there's a connection, and it's called the gut-brain axis. But it could also be called the gut immune brain axis, because the immune system is obviously involved with this inflammatory response. But you can have inflammation on your skin, and you can get acne, early aging in the joints. You can have it in the vascular system, and you can have more advanced onset of vascular disease that can create damage to the lining of the arteries and then promote the development of atherosclerosis. So from having a leaky gut, you can have all of these injurious situations throughout the body. In addition, when you have chronic inflammation, it drives insulin resistance. And then you're more prone to getting diabetes. That's a big deal because that's associated with many other terrible downstream outcomes in the body. So having a leaky gut is a big deal. So what causes a leaky gut? Well, many things cause a leaky gut. Eating chemicals in your food, anything that kills the good bacteria. Now, when we meaning humanity, invented things like preservatives, we put in pesticides in foods and chemical preservatives designed to kill living things like bacteria. Well, no one understood that our bodies are involved with these bacteria. They're a critical part of our health system. And so now, by accident, we created all kinds of chemicals that we put into our food that actually, when consumed, will kill the good microbes. And when you create a vacuum, the bad guys will always fill in the void. In addition, what else do? We take antibiotics, and we give antibiotics to our farm animals. And why do we do that? To prevent infection? Actually, no. It's to promote them getting fat. So that's another problem, because when you have a gut that's dysbiotic and you have leaky gut, you have this chronic state of inflammation, which promotes insulin resistance, which promotes fat production and storage. So you can actually become diabetic and obese when you have a leaky gut. And they do that to animals on purpose so that they'll fatten up faster to get a bigger price on the market. And these are not healthy animals, and their weight is not because they have more lean body mass, it's because they have more inflammatory fat. This is a terrible thing. about our agribusiness today and the raising of animals for food is that they do this and they give antibiotics. It was asked that they stop, but it was voluntary, and so you can imagine what the response has been. So be aware that if you get animals that don't say specifically that they're raised antibiotic free, they are for sure going to have, most likely anyway, antibiotics, which is going to then harm you because you are what you eat. It is what it is. So there are so many other ways that we can have leaky gut. Chronic stress and emotions, lack of sleep, and having hormonal imbalances. For women, it can be having hormonal contraceptives. It can be going through menopause. And like I said, stress can do that. When women become pregnant, they develop a dysbiotic gut microbiome. But this is temporary, and it's a weird thing, but it's on purpose to create a low level of inflammation to drive the woman who is pregnant to gain and store fat. That's nature's way of taking what later in other types of situations becomes pathological and utilizing that special kind of a situation to help pregnant women, especially if you think way back thousands of years ago when food was scarce, to help them to put on fat, which is essential if they were going to be able to breastfeed the baby and there was any kind of food shortage. So, leaky gut, impaired gut barrier, separation of the lining cells, these specialized enterocytes, creating a space that allows toxic contents within the intestinal lumen to leak out into the body, into the associated tissue called the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, which has home to many types of immune cells that can create chronic states of inflammation, antibody production, which can lead to increase of autoimmune disease, and all the underlying conditions that are plaguing mankind that are due to chronic states of systemic inflammation. So leaky gut is not something we want. And what I'm going to do in our next show is tell you, now that you know about it, what are we going to do about it so that we can help resolve it. So thank you so much for joining me. I can't wait to join you again to talk about how to resolve leaky gut. And everyone, have a great day. Stay well. See you soon.